On today's Star Wars Factions Compared video, we look at the leadership and government of the 4 main original and prequel trilogy factions. Hey guys, this is Eckhart's Ladder. Hello and welcome to a continuation of the Factions Compared series. I know with yesterday's video, I said I was finished, but what I meant by that is I was finished all I had planned to start off with. You guys have said, without question, that you want more, so here we are. Before we begin, I just have a couple of quick announcements. The first is, by the time this video is out, I suspect that I will have come close to passing 100,000 subscribers, if not tonight, then tomorrow. I want to take a second and thank all of you guys for helping me get here. I started uploading on this channel in March, started taking it seriously in about June, and I want to thank you guys for allowing me to do this as a full-time job. I do have some fun stuff planned to celebrate 100K, but more about that in the new year. Also, I just want to say, because of the overwhelmingly positive response to this series, I will be continuing it indefinitely. The new name will be Factions Compared. I've made a playlist which you can view, I'll link it down in the comments, and I'll be taking suggestions for not only new subjects to look at, but also for new factions, whether Star Wars or otherwise. Because of the, again, incredible response from you guys, I will be focusing on this a bit for a while. If you start to get tired of it, make sure to let me know. Alright, let's get back on topic, and as I mentioned, today we are talking about leadership and government. We'll be looking specifically at not only people, but also the structures in place which allowed these factions to operate. We will run into some difficulty when looking at the Confederacy of Independent Systems and the Galactic Republic, because they were both being manipulated by Darth Sidious and destined to fail, but we'll deal with that more when we get there. As is tradition, we'll start with the Galactic Empire. The Galactic Empire was a fascist dictatorship, with all power residing in Emperor Palpatine, so an evaluation of the government and leadership of the Empire can largely be an evaluation of Palpatine himself. Admittedly, other leadership styles were tried after the Battle of Endor, however those are outside the scope of today's video. As I mentioned, the General Empire was governed completely based on the will of Emperor Palpatine. However, obviously not all of the government's affairs were directly managed by Palpatine himself. He was aided considerably by a ruling council, and the galaxy was subdivided into sectors which were managed by Moffs. For a time, an elected Senate did have apparent power over Imperial bureaucracy. However, after the construction of the Death Star, the Empire chose to keep systems in line through fear instead of political appeasement. This doctrine was in fact one of the Empire's greatest flaws. In such a large galaxy, it would never be possible to keep pressure on every group who disagreed with the way you ran your government. Acts of terror like the destruction of Alderaan only served to radicalize rebel groups, while also driving sympathy for anti-imperial causes. Rebellion was also fostered by the oppressive nature of the government and the arbitrary enforcement of imperial rule. While propaganda was somewhat effective at fostering pro-empire sentiment, certain areas of the galaxy, particularly those away from the galactic core, were not only treated worse, but also less supervised. In my opinion, under this model of government in a galaxy as large as the Star Wars galaxy, it was only a matter of time until full rebellion occurred and the government was toppled. Looking at leadership, Palpatine himself was cunning, he was incredibly intelligent, but he was not infallible. Having all power centralized in one man meant that his faults were magnified and had severe impacts on the Empire. A prime example of this would be his underestimation of the Rebel Alliance at the Battle of Endor. Outside of Palpatine, military and political leadership was of highly variable quality. On one hand, you have masterminds like Thrawn, but there were also an immeasurable amount of totally corrupt or incompetent leaders. All in all, either despite or because of the ruthlessness and dark side power of Palpatine, the Empire existed for less than half a century. That reign pales in comparison with our next faction, which governed the galaxy in some form for over 25,000 years, the Galactic Republic. Unsurprisingly, the Galactic Republic in its long history saw many drastic changes. However, the Republic structure did seem to be relatively stable since the Ruusan Reformation, which occurred about 1,000 years before its end. Obviously, throughout its history, the style and quality of leadership also drastically varied. We'll be looking at the Republic as it existed during the Clone Wars. Let's first examine the structure of the Republic, and I think it's clear that there were some serious problems with both the effectiveness and the quality of governing done by the Republic. Still, the longevity itself should be admired somewhat. The Republic existed without fracturing for over 1,000 years after the Ruusan Reformation, and for countless years before that. Although at times infected by corruption, the Republic did have functional judiciary, executive, and legislative branches. It was only through countless generations of unseen Sith working in the shadows, which culminated in Palpatine, that the Republic was eventually toppled. Though by the time of the Clone Wars, corruption and ineffectiveness had reached such a degree that many thought civil war was inevitable regardless. That left many, including then Jedi Master Count Dooku, to lose all faith in the government. Much of this is attributable to the fact that bought politicians, bribes, and special interests had completely integrated within the Republic hierarchy. With the Clone Wars, the prophesized civil war had come to fruition due to the total breakdown of the representative democracy. All of this is perhaps best represented by Coruscant itself, the shiny seat of government filled with vices, temptations, and almost an endless supply of credits ready to buy politicians. By the time of the Clone Wars, the Republic was also completely demilitarized. They had no standing army, no navy, and even the Jedi, who did dispense justice, more or less worked on their own accord. This total lack of a fighting force is what led Sifo Dyas to, without authorization, order the creation of a clone army, which appropriately would play a key role in the destruction of the Republic. The way the Republic was set up made it very difficult for an effective, well-intentioned leader to do real good. Before Palpatine, past chancellors like Valorum had been exceptionally politically minded, though not great leaders. And although the role of Chancellor itself had a good deal of executive power, only someone willing to bribe politicians or otherwise play dirty could gain control of the legislative branch, the Senate. Because, due to the presence of Sidious, it's difficult to look at Clone Wars era Republic leadership, I'll focus most of my ranking on the government structure itself. Next we have the Rebel Alliance, which has a distinct advantage over the past two factions. The Rebel Alliance only had to fight a war, not govern an entire galaxy. Nonetheless, the Alliance did have resource management, foreign relation, and other responsibilities, so it had a civil branch and a military branch. Admittedly, it was hard to distinguish the civil and military sides of the Rebel Alliance during the Galactic Civil War, especially because Mon Mothma was the highest ranking official in both areas. Given the small size of the Alliance and the frequent loss of high-ranking Alliance officials, the organization had to be run effectively. The Alliance had no legislative or judicial branch, and all power was solely vested in the executive. During the Galactic Civil War, Mon Mothma had total control over the Alliance, although she did frequently take into consideration the opinions of other high-ranking officials. Although we are dealing with legends, we see in canon that this was almost disastrous at the Battle of Scarif, where most of the Alliance was split regarding not only whether the installation should be attacked, but whether the Alliance was viable going into the future. Still, during wartime, I think this is a relatively balanced structure. Having an elected Supreme Commander who listens to the advice of high-ranking civil and military officials. Generally, I would think that having such a blurred line between the military and civil governance would be dangerous, but given the predicament of the Rebel Alliance, I think it suited their needs well. Largely because the Rebels are the protagonists of the original trilogy, the Alliance is seen as relatively functional and the leadership as competent. Mistakes are made, but you don't see the same level of corruption, for instance, as you would in the Empire or the Republic. Having a position of power within the Alliance itself offered no real influence over the galaxy. The only real hope was that the Alliance would win the war, and that a new republic would be formed. This meant that individuals like Borsk Phalia, who would be in other situations an issue, were still working hard during the days of the Alliance to try to secure victory. Arguably, the Alliance's most significant weakness was the inexperience of some of its leaders. Militarily, for example, we see Lando and Han Solo rise to the rank of general extremely quickly. The competence of people in those situations isn't necessarily guaranteed. Considering that the Alliance is basically a collection of worlds and groups that came together to fight a common goal, I would say that it operated fairly well and that its leaders were of high caliber. Finally, we have the Confederacy of Independent Systems, and this is the most difficult of the factions to actually examine. For one, we know less about the Confederacy than any of the other factions. We also know that Darth Sidious was using the Confederacy as a pawn, and that they were ultimately destined to fail. Finally, the CIS is kind of in a weird spot where it's half government, half military force, sort of like the Alliance. Based on my understanding, Count Dooku, as Confederate head of state, had control over both the military and civilian arms of the CIS. There was also a further separatist council which seemed to deal with other miscellaneous issues. The real weakness of the CIS was that it allowed someone like Dooku, who actually had nefarious purposes, to walk in and assume command of the entire organization. With Dooku just assuming power and not being held responsible or elected in any sort of way, the faction was ultimately self-defeating. Arguably, you could say the same about the Rebel Alliance. The difference is just the leadership. Alliance leadership had the best intentions in fighting the war. Separatist leadership, at least at Dooku and above, did not. It's not even like the Republic, which was infiltrated by a clever Sith. The CIS was doomed to fail from the very beginning. If we could somehow ignore this one major flaw, the Confederacy is actually fairly well run and well led. Despite being a much smaller government, the Confederacy really took the war to the Republic, gaining many significant victories and even attacking Coruscant itself. It's impressive that they managed to take care of their civil responsibilities while also fighting an all-out war. However, I don't know how you can say that an organization which was completely manipulated and used almost exclusively as a pawn was successful in any sort of meaningful way. With now an understanding of the four factions, let's get to ranking them. At number 1 is the Rebel Alliance. Largely because they are the good guys of the original trilogy, the Alliance is seen as being relatively well structured and under competent leadership. The rebels were able to defeat an enemy much larger and much more well armed than they were. The gap between the Alliance and number 2 is quite vast in my opinion, and I really went back and forth on which faction should get this position. I ultimately decided on the Empire, because although the Republic did stand for 1,000 years, to be fair, I think it's only reasonable to consider the Clone Wars era Republic. The Empire, although totally flawed in its own way, at least had a leader who wanted the government to continue existing and who was relatively intelligent. Sure, Sidious made mistakes, and the structure of the Empire was such that rebellion and really the toppling of the government was, in my opinion, inevitable. However, it was still better than the third faction, which in my opinion is the Galactic Republic. Although it had stood for thousands of years, by the time of the Clone Wars, the Republic was awash with corruption and just overall ineffectiveness. Through the machinations of Sidious and other Sith Lords, the Republic was in such a position that the only person who could assume leadership was one who was completely corrupt. If we go back 500 years, sure, things would maybe be different, but when dealing with the Clone Wars, I don't see any real way that the Republic can beat the Empire. Really, Palpatine had absolute power over both of them, but he only wanted the Empire to survive. The Republic's structure wasn't sound enough to repel that kind of threat, so it gets the number 3 spot. Number 4 is the Confederacy. I think I've explained this all earlier, but in my opinion, no amount of sound structure can save a faction from being doomed from the start. Those, however, are just my opinions. What do you think? Is the Republic worse or better than I said? Is the Empire the top government ever, or am I being too hard on the Separatists? Let me know all of that and more down in the comments. And while you're there, don't forget to put any ideas for future videos that you may have. Thank you once again to everyone for watching. As always, this has been Eckhart's Ladder. May the Force be with you.